Today we're bringing you the story of a book stolen by the Nazis back in 1938, and how it was rediscovered 84 years later by a librarian who is our guest today on this episode of Talk in the Library.
You're listening to Talk in the Library, a National Library of Israel podcast.
Welcome to Talk in the Library, where we explore the stories that shape us. My name is Shai Ben-Ari, and today we're bringing you the story of a particular item in the National Library's collections. This is the story of a book stolen by the Nazis, a book stolen from a boy who received it as a gift on the day of his Bar Mitzvah, the day he became a man. This book was hidden away by the Nazis, along with thousands of others. But today we're going to be focusing on how it eventually arrived here in Jerusalem at the National Library of Israel, and how it was discovered by one of our own expert librarians, Mr. Daniel Lipson, who is with us today. And I'll just add that Daniel also functions as our own in-house book detective. How are you doing, Daniel?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, Shai, on the show.
Great having you here. And maybe let's just begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing at the library all these years, and what's your expertise?
So I've been working at the National Library of Israel for about 14 years now. I'm a reference librarian, and our team assists researchers with their work when it comes to use the library and the library's collections. And I manage the Diaspora Treasure project at the library. In this project, we have a small team, a dedicated team, and we're going through tens of thousands of library books, trying to identify those books that were looted by the Nazis or lost during the Holocaust, and then eventually arrived in Israel at the National Library many years later.
Right. We're going to dive into all of that. But let's maybe focus back on this particular book. You're the one who made this discovery. Let's start with what book this actually is. What are we talking about? Okay,
so it's a Mesilat Yesharim, a classic book of Jewish ethics, written by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in the 18th century. It was given as a Bar Mitzvah gift to a boy in Vienna for his Bar Mitzvah in 1936, March 1936.
Right. Okay, and what really made you first notice this book? What was special about it? What stood out?
So I've been working on these Nazi-looted books for a few years now, and different telltale signs which can tell us that this book was looted and how it arrived in Israel, etc. So I knew that this book had been looted, and I also knew that it arrived in Israel at the library from Austria, from Vienna. And there was, on the first page, there was a handwritten, what looked like a handwritten dedication. The only problem was that the piece of white paper had been pasted over the words. So I could just make out that it was given to someone by someone, but nothing more than that.
You saw the hint of a dedication, several words.
Several words at the beginning and at the end, but I couldn't make out any more than that. And I wasn't going to peel away the white piece of paper because I probably would have ruined the rest of the text.
But you had a suspicion there, and really in the context of these kinds of books, a dedication is everything, really, because a dedication tells you.
Definitely. It can tell us a whole story, who gave a book to who and when and why.
Right.
So this was obviously important information. So I brought this book to the library's preservation and restoration lab, where they used their tools and their chemicals to peel away the white label very carefully. And below it, I discovered the whole story.
Right. And that's a whole process. I mean, it's a very delicate procedure in terms of removing labels or all sorts of obstructions. The Conservation Lab has a lot of experience with that, of course, but it's delicate work. And did it take a while?
Yes, it took a while. They did an amazing job, and they've helped me in the past and on other books as well, using the tools that they have.
Right. So eventually this dedication is revealed, and of course we'll show it to you. But I should probably read it out just so our listeners can understand what we're talking about here. Of course, the dedication was written in Hebrew, but I'll translate here. The dedication reads, "To the pleasant, persistent, and God-fearing young man, may his candle shine, David Dov, in celebration of his Bar Mitzvah, a gift from the family of S. Schoenfeld, Vienna, Thursday, on the eve of the Holy Sabbath, Parashat Kitisa, 5696, meaning 1936. So this is a Jewish boy living in Vienna who in 1936 is celebrating his bar mitzvah, meaning he's 13 in 36. He'll be 16 in 1939 when World War II breaks out. And in fact, the Nazis arrive in Austria, in Vienna, a year before that in 1938 when he's only 15. So you realize here, okay, there's a story here. This bar mitzvah gift was given to a boy who almost immediately afterwards is a witness and is really part of a terrible historical episode. But let's maybe step back for a bit. You touched on it earlier, but from the moment you open this book, you're already sort of aware, even before you see this dedication, that there has to be a sort of tragic circumstances because this book is part of a special collection that you mentioned. It's called Diaspora Treasures. So what does that really mean, Diaspora Treasures?
So during the war, 1944, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and its library, today's National Library of Israel, knew about what was going on in Europe, obviously. The Nazis looted millions of books across Europe from anyone considered an enemy of the Reich, including, of course, the Jews. But they wanted to try and save the books and the Jewish libraries that many of the professors had used just a few years beforehand and bring these lost and looted libraries to Israel. So they established a committee called the Committee for the Saving of the Diaspora Treasures, meaning these books as treasures coming from the diaspora. In the later decades, the committee became a department, the Diaspora Treasure Department. They brought hundreds of thousands of books from Europe to Israel. And now, just recently, we have reopened their work, and we are working on a project which we call the Diaspora Treasure Project to try and find these books here in the National Library's collections and identify them and see who they belong to.
Right.
And according to previous research, I knew that this specific book had arrived from Vienna.
Right. So when the Nazis enter Austria, we're talking March 12th, 1938, what's known as the Anschluss, of course. They very soon begin looting Jewish property, and of course that includes books in both public libraries that serve the Jewish community, but also private collections. What happens to these books at this point when the Nazis roll into Vienna? What begins to happen, really? So
first they close down different institutions and the big libraries like the Jewish Community Library and other large collections. They close them down and send these books to Berlin. In Berlin, they are collecting books of whoever is considered an enemy of the Reich, including, of course, the Jewish people. And after a few years, they actually accumulate some 2 to 3 million books in Berlin, including many books which had been sent there from Vienna. Other books in Vienna are hidden away by the Jewish community. Some are hidden in the Jewish cemetery and in other places, but the majority were taken by the Nazis to Germany. And they stored them in all sorts of different locations, even in castles, like at Tanzenberg Castle. So there were many different organizations in Nazi Germany interested in putting their hands on these books. In the case of this book and millions of others, they were taken by what was later called the Reich Security Head Office. They dealt with all security and intelligence issues during the war, and they created a huge library of books which they'd stolen first from Germany, before the war broke out, and then from Austria, and then from other places across Europe. I just want to point out, you're aware of all this before you actually even open this book and see and find the dedication. So all that context is clear to you. But here you discover something very personal in this dedication that we just read. What really went through your mind when you were able to read the full sentence there? What do you start to think about there? Well, first of all, it mentions that the book was given to Davidov, no family name. We don't know his family name. It was given to him for his bar mitzvah on the Torah reading, the parsha of Ki Tisa, which just happens to be my bar mitzvah as well. So this is a few years before the war breaks out. What happened to this boy? Did he survive? Was he a victim? Where is he today? Maybe he's still alive today somewhere. I had enough information here, both about the boy, the date, the person who gave the book. So try and do a little bit of research. Right. Okay. And how does that work? What do you discover? Right. So there are many different databases and tools to use. But the first place to start is the Yad Vashem Holocaust Victim Names database. So I only had a first name, Davidov, but I knew his bar mitzvah was in 1936 and that he lived in Vienna. So that was enough information to start a search. And I found the name Davidov from Vienna, born in 1923. Since his bar mitzvah was in 1936, I knew I had found the owner of the book. So here you have a candidate because he essentially fits the puzzle, correct? Exactly. There was one other Davidov from Vienna, but the year was wrong. our Davidov was definitely born in 1923. And the information was based on a testimony page in the Yad Vashem database.
Okay, and that's where you actually first see a possible last name.
Exactly. So we know that the boy's name was Davidov Bernard, and his family name was Neuwirth.
Okay.
And they were the family was from Austria, from Vienna. And we have the name of his father, the name of his mother. And the information at the bottom of the page says that he was deported with his family and disappeared, whatever that means.
Right. Okay. So you don't exactly know from this particular database too many details about what happened to the family, but it's the beginning of a trail of evidence. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. It helps a lot because now I have a family name.
So that information leads you maybe to another database where you find a little bit more information about what happened to the family.
Exactly. There's an Austrian Holocaust database where now that I had the family name, I could search for them, and I found the names of Davidov and his family. They unfortunately were deported from Vienna on the 14th of September 1942 and sent to a place near Minsk called Mali Trastonets, where they were all murdered on the 18th of September 1942.
Right. They were shot by the Nazi firing squads.
Yeah, once they arrived at this place, they were marched into the forest and killed there together with many other Jews.
Okay, but now we at least have a much more complete picture of who this person is and who the family is. And you essentially begin to examine where we might be able to find survivors or remnants of this family and maybe even make contact, because we have really what is a relic, a family heirloom, with this book containing this special dedication.
Right. So the next place to search was in what we call immigration questionnaires, which we have from Austria, which we have in the National Library's collection. So in 1938, when the Nazis arrive in Austria, the Jews realize that they have to leave as quickly as possible. And this is what the Nazis want as well, to get the Jews out of Austria. But you can't just pack up your bag and leave. If you want to immigrate to a different country, that country needs to want to accept you. And many countries were not interested in thousands of refugees arriving just before the war. So if you are an Austrian Jew and you wanted to leave, you'd have to go to the Jewish Community Office and pick up a questionnaire, an immigration questionnaire, which you fill in with your name, address, date of birth, the names of your family members, your profession. Do you have a passport? Do you have money? What languages can you speak? Which country would you like to immigrate to? And do you have some contact in that country who can help you?
So all of this really leaves a whole trail of documentation that you know should exist, because we're talking about a Jewish family that lives in Vienna, part of the Jewish community. And we also have a certain stroke of good fortune here, because at the National Library of Israel, we happen to have the records of the Jewish community in Vienna kept at the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, which is an organization within the National Library. So those records are really right at hand for you, and you can basically go straight there.
Exactly, and they've been scanned as well. So this is the next stage. I search for the Neuwirth family in these records, and I find Rabbi Samuel Simcha Neuwirth, head of the family, his wife and his children. They want to immigrate. And we have all this information at our fingertips now. So he writes the names of his wife, Irma, his children, Ilsa, Davidov Bernard, Marianne, and Liselotta. The names are all on these forms.
So you were able to cross-reference the information, and suddenly you find Davidov in official documentation from the Jewish community in Vienna in our own records. Really.
Right. But it didn't work. They filled in these papers, and the papers were processed like many others. Many Jews managed to escape thanks to these questionnaires and the countries that accepted them.
Right, they were looking to escape. That's why they did all this paperwork. They wanted to get out of Austria quick. But in this case, they were not so fortunate. Other families were able to get out. But here, the approval did not come through. Right.
About 135 to 140,000 Jews managed to escape in time, but the Neuwirth family didn't. And we know that they were deported to a place near Minsk where they were all killed.
Right. And at some point, you were able to find out that Davidov has living relatives, descendants, of course, of the family, who are still alive today, and you were able to make certain contact with them.
So I checked the Yad Vashem database again, and then I found one more testimony page, which I'd missed the first time round. This testimony page includes a picture of Davidov as well, so now I knew what he actually looked like.
Amazing.
But what was interesting was the name of the person who had sent this into Yad Vashem. Since the 1950s, people have been sending in testimony pages, and an important detail is to write your name and your connection to the victim. In this case, the person who sent the testimony page in was called Ilse Deutsch, and she was the sister of David Dov. So I had to go back to my notes. I checked again the Austrian database, and I realized that the parents were killed, David Dov was killed, and so were two of his sisters. But one was missing. And then I checked again, I found that Ilse Deutsch, Ilse Neuwirth at the time, had filled in her own immigration questionnaire, and she had managed to make it out of Austria in time. Now that we knew that David's sister had survived, I wondered if I could find out any more information. I checked for Ilse Deutsch on one of the genealogy websites. We do a lot of genealogy work in the library, but unfortunately I discovered she had passed away in 2018, just a few years before I'd started looking into this book. But on the Yad Vashem testimony page, she writes her address. She lives in London. I have plenty of family in London, and I hope that perhaps one of my relatives would have known her when she was still alive. So we have a WhatsApp group. I sent a short message to all my cousins, and slowly I started getting answers back. Yes, I know the son. I go to the same synagogue with him.
Amazing.
I know the daughter. She's next door neighbors to someone else. And in the end, one of my cousins gave me an email of one of the family members. And I remember sitting down to compose an email, a letter, and I wondered, what should I write? I'm going to write to the family, the survivors of the Neuwirth family, explaining that I found a book that had belonged to their uncle or great uncle in the National Library's collections. I sent the email out in the evening and went home, imagining what was happening across the world, what effect this email had, hopefully on many people, many members of the Neuwirth family. It didn't take long for one of Ilse Deutsch's granddaughters to get back to me. And I spoke to Dvora, and she started filling me in with all the information that I was missing. So we know that the family did want to immigrate from Vienna. They filled in the forms, but they didn't make it. It turns out that David Dov himself was ill with polio, and no country would want to accept someone with such a terrible disease. So the family had to remain. Rabbi Neuwirth himself was head of community. He wanted to stay with his community. Not everybody could leave. The elderly couldn't leave. So we ended up staying in Austria, eventually being deported to Minsk, where they were killed. And it turns out that Dvora herself actually lives 5 minutes away from where I live here in Israel.
Oh, amazing.
So that was a big surprise. And the first thing I did was to bring the book home and show her the book that had belonged to her great uncle, the brother of her grandmother. Not long after that, the family came from London to Dvora's son's Bar Mitzvah, and we showed them around the library, took them on a tour. Of course, we showed them the book and prepared them a nice gift. And this was a very nice way to close the story of a Bar Mitzvah boy who was killed during the Holocaust, but his book had survived to tell the tale.
That must have been an incredible moment when they arrive at the library and see the book and they meet you. You're the person who really made this discovery and allowed this closing of the circle.
Yeah, it was a really special event, but we didn't invite just the descendants of the Neuwirth family. If you remember, on the dedication in the book, it says that the book was given to David Dov by the S. Schonfeld family.
Correct.
So shortly after I'd done this research, I wrote a short article for the National Library's blog. And a day or two later, I get an email from Debbie from Yad Vashem, who says, I've heard about the book that you discovered in the National Library collections. And this was a bit of a surprise to me because I hadn't really told anybody about it yet. So we chatted, and it turns out that the story is even more surprising. David Dov's father, Rabbi Shmuel Simcha, had a friend, Rabbi Shabtai Schonfeld, in Vienna. Rabbi Shabtai Schonfeld was the person who wrote the dedication in the book. The Schonfeld's son was a good friend of David Dov. David Dov was killed, but the son makes it to the United States, where he becomes a famous rabbi in New York, Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld, who is known to many Jews from New York. Mm-hmm. And Rabbi Fabian's daughter, Debbie, works in Yad Vashem. So Debbie hears about this story from Ilse Deutsch's granddaughter, and this is how it all gets connected. Right. So some of the Schonfelds live in Israel, and they also join us for this meeting in the National Library, which was really a very special and emotional meeting.
Let's maybe take a step back, because we have this amazing story at the center of all this, but of course we're talking about a much larger historical episode, of course, of the stealing of Jewish property, of Jewish books, a massive effort by the Nazis during World War II. But if we remember, when the Nazis first come to power, they're thinking along different lines. One of the first things that the Nazis do after coming to power in May of 1933 is they actually begin burning books. The famous bonfire incident at the Bebelplatz in Berlin. But here we're talking much later, 1939, 1938, where they're no longer burning books. They're stealing them, but keeping them. Now, why are they keeping them now instead of burning them?
So it's true. At first, in 10th of May, 1933, students and Joseph Goebbels organized these mass book burnings of authors who are considered un-German. Mm-hmm. But very quickly, Nazi leadership and Nazi academic scholars understand that it's far more important to keep these books and these archives of whoever's considered an enemy of the German people so that they can be researched. Mm-hmm. And during the war, you have Nazi scholars sitting down in libraries using looted books, doing anti-Semitic scholarship and writing about Jews and Freemasons and other and communists, etc., or even during the war. So they needed these books. And wherever they went, they looted them.
So one of the key figures in this Nazi effort, which they invested an enormous amount of work and energy and resources in, is Alfred Rosenberg, one of the senior Nazi figures. What was his role in all of this?
So Alfred Rosenberg was the chief ideologist of the Nazi party. Later, he became a minister in charge of countries conquered by the Nazis in Eastern Europe. He wanted to create a type of Nazi academy, a Nazi university. Mm-hmm. But the only institute which he managed to create in time during the war, the beginning of the war, was the Institute for the Research of the Jewish Question, which was established in Frankfurt. And he had teams of professionals traveling across Europe, collecting, looting books that belonged to Jewish communities, Jewish collections, and communists and other enemies of Germany. And he had these books sent back to his institute in Frankfurt and also to Berlin, where they were used during the war. Mm-hmm.
And in the case of David Dov's family, for example, we don't know exactly what was the trail of the family's private collection in this book among them. We don't know exactly how they arrived in Nazi hands, but it's possible that, for example, before they were deported, they were ordered to bring their property forward and to deposit it with the Nazis.
So we don't know exactly what happened to David Dov's book, whether it was looted or it was hidden away somewhere in Austria, but it was discovered after the war, and together with hundreds of thousands of other books, eventually sent to Israel.
Right. And within these different Nazi institutions that were devoted to theft of Jewish property, you also had Jews who were forced to work as forced labor in these institutions, and they were basically being used for their expertise, of course, in Jewish material and Jewish literature.
One of the most famous cases was in Vienna, where there were many Jewish libraries and archives, and the Nazis understood that they couldn't just loot all of this and have them sent back to Germany. They'd have to go through the books, deciding what was important for them and what was not. And they used Jewish scholars and academics and authors and writers to go through the material and decide what should be kept and what should not. These individuals spent some of the time hiding away precious Jewish books and archives and manuscripts, and many of them survived, many of them didn't. But ironically, the material that Nazis looted actually helped them survive, because many of these books otherwise would have been destroyed by fires, by bombing, etc.
Right.
So sending them back to Germany in many cases actually helped them survive the war.
Right. So after the war, once the Nazis are defeated, you have these books dispersed in different locations across Germany, across Austria, I think. The Nazis have been collecting them, of course, and the Allies gradually take over these territories and then find all this looted material. And then there begins a sort of effort to regather everything together and to try to find out, okay, we have a lot of stolen property. What do we do with it? Who does it go back to? Is it always possible to even return these books? What happens then?
So the largest collection of books that the US military discover are from Alfred Rosenberg's Institute in Frankfurt. Mm-hmm. They collect some 1.5 million books and bring them to Offenbach, which is just across the river from Frankfurt. Mm-hmm. And they start going through these books. Their aim is to try and give them back to the countries from where they were stolen. So in many cases, the books were still in their crates. They hadn't even been opened yet, and it was easy to send them back. The military worked in Offenbach for about 3 years, and they processed about 3 million books in those years till about 1949. Mm-hmm. But in the end, there remain hundreds of thousands of books, which obviously belong to Jewish communities and Jewish individuals, which didn't survive. And they're not sure what to do with these books anymore. So a Jewish corporation called the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which included quite a few Jewish organizations.
Worldwide, of course.
Worldwide. Mm-hmm. One of the leading ones was the Hebrew University and the National Library here in Israel.
Right. We should mention that the National Library of Israel back then was called the Jewish National and University Library, and it was invited essentially to come and be part of this effort to gather this stolen property and return it to its owners, assuming that is even possible.
Right. So if they can't find the original owners, if the original owners were killed and the communities were closed down, we'll try and give it to the next best thing, the survivors and the Jewish communities across the world. There are many Jewish libraries in the United States, in England, and of course in Israel. So after a lot of discussion, they decided that about 40% of these books will be sent to Israel by the National Library, by the Hebrew University. 40% are sent to the United States, and the rest are sent to different communities across the world.
Right. And of course, the story of David Dove's book is a very emotional and moving one, but here we're talking about a very personal item. But of course, this collection also includes historic items of incredible significance to the Jewish people. For example, the Worms Machzor is essentially part of this collection, which you can see today in the permanent exhibition at the National Library, and other items as well, correct?
Yeah, so the Worms Machzor was taken by the Nazis just before the synagogue in Worms was burned down during Kristallnacht. There was an order from Reinhard Heydrich, who headed the SD and then Gestapo and then the Reichssecurity head office. He said, go ahead, do what you like, but save the archives, save the books. We're going to need these. So this treasure, this huge manuscript from 1272 was taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Worms, and a brave archivist, Friedrich Illert, who lived in the city, managed to find it there in the headquarters, take it out, hide it through the war, and then send it to Israel during the 1950s, where it is on display today. Not far from it, on display, is the Rothschild Haggadah, which belonged to the famous Rothschild family. This manuscript was also looted, and it ended up in the United States, and it was only in 1980 when experts realized that this was the missing Rothschild Haggadah. And it was returned to Dorothy de Rothschild, who gave it to the National Library. It's on display next to a book of Zohar, which is also which was looted by the Nazis, found after the war in Theresienstadt, sent to Prague, and now on display as well. These are very rare items, manuscripts or early editions, but the Nazis looted whatever they could put their hands on. So among the Nazi looted books in the library, you have children's books or books to learn Hebrew. They didn't go through everything that they stole. They just stole everything. I hope that after the war, they could use some of the books and some of them would be thrown away. But we're very pleased that all of these books, or many of these books, are back in Jewish hands here in the National Library.
How many books are at the National Library, which are really part of this collection that was restored?
So that's a very good question, because the numbers change over the years. We are working on a project right now to try and figure out how many books we actually have. The National Library was part of the Hebrew University. So many of these books ended up in department libraries in the university, not only in the National Collection. Some books were missing, some books were exchanged for other books. So today we know that there are at least 35,000 book records. A record could mean a number of copies or a number of volumes. So I'd say we have about 50,000 Nazi looted books or books that went missing during the Holocaust in the National Library today.
Incredible. maybe we'll just end on, you have a very personal connection to this collection, and it's really the reason you began working on it. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
So not long after I started working at the National Library, I came across a manuscript, a Pinkas Mohel, a notebook that belonged to a Mohel, and it was quite common that a Mohel who would circumcise a Jewish baby boy would write down in his notebook the date, the name of the parents, the name of the boy who had just been given his name. And this specific Pinkas Mohel that I found belonged to none other than my grandfather's grandfather's grandfather, which was a great surprise. It was something very special. And my first question was, how did this arrive in the National Library of Israel? So we went through some of the library's old ledgers. There was very little information. The only thing that we could find were two words, Offenbach, 1946.
Right.
So we know Offenbach was a place where many of the books were collected, and the US military started going through them in 1946.
But you didn't know that at the time.
I had no idea what this meant at the time.
You didn't know what Offenbach 1936 meant.
I didn't know what Offenbach was, what happened there in 1946, but I started getting interested in it. I started reading and looking into the topic a bit more, and the older generation of librarians working at the time in the National Library told me, yes, many books arrived at the library during the 1950s, even in the 1960s, from Europe, survivors of the Holocaust. So I thought it was very interesting, and I decided to take a closer look and try and find these books, which many of them are regular books, which can be used by anyone who wants to come to the library. The books themselves aren't always so special. What is special is where they came from, who they belong to, which community they belong to. And sometimes we can find a name of the previous owner, like this example here of David Dov Neuwirth's book, which he got for his Bar Mitzvah.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think that's a great place to conclude our conversation. Thanks for tuning in to Talk in the Library, a National Library of Israel podcast. This episode was recorded at Nomi Studios in Jerusalem. Join us next time.